Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this Sevan Spatial live stream this afternoon. Our presenter today is Natalia Wee, and she'll be speaking to you about engaging with Mana Whenua. If you do have any questions while Natalia is presenting, please pop them into the question and answer box. And I'll now hand you over to Natalia. Thank you.
Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you for joining this webinar around engaging with Mana Whenua. Today we're going to explore who Mana Whenua are and why engagement is essential and how to build meaningful relationships based on consultation, collaboration and partnership. First off, we will start with a karakia. If you know this karakia, please join in. However, I will lead it for us. Tū tawa mai I runga, tū tawa mai I raro, tū tawa mai I roto, tū tawa mai I waho. Kia tau ai te mauri tū, kia tau ai te mauri ora ki te katoa, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Ka pai. Before we get into our content today, just a bit of whakawhanaungatanga if you weren't at the Te Ao Māori presentation last week. He uri tēnei no te aupori, Ngāti Kuri, Ngāti Porou me te aitanga hauiti, ko Natalia Wee tōku ingoa. So my name's Natalia Wee. I am an educator in the Te Ao Māori space, and I whakapapa back to Te Aupori, Ngāti Kuri in the very far north. If you've ever been to Cape Reinga or 90 Mile Beach, that's where my people are from, and also the East Coast, Ngāti Porou and te aitanga hauiti. I'd really love to see where everyone is joining in from today. So please feel free to introduce yourself and put where you're from in the chat. I'd love to get that engagement going. Ka pai. So our learning intentions, our learning outcomes for today. By the end of the session, I hope that you'll be more confident in the why and how of engaging with Mana Whenua, and you'll understand the role of Mana Whenua, including the rights and responsibilities in connection to the whenua or the land. You will recognise the importance of culturally appropriate engagement, identify key principles and strategies for consultation, collaboration and partnership, and this will help you to build more deeper and enduring relationships with Mana Whenua in your mahi. So some of the keywords and concepts that you will encounter throughout this webinar, and please feel free to repeat these words after I say them to become more familiar with them if you haven't heard them before. First off, Mana Whenua. Mana Whenua. Mana Whenua is the Māori tribes or sub-tribes with ancestral authority over specific lands connected to a place through whakapapa, genealogy. Our next keyword, iwi, a tribe. This is a large tribe of Māori. Hapu, hapu. These are sub-tribes, and they're smaller groups that come off main tribes. Whakapapa. Whakapapa. Now, whakapapa is genealogy or lineage, and it's for Māori the foundation of our identity, our connection to land, our ancestors and our hapori, our communities. Mana. Mana. Mana is a Māori concept around authority, prestige, power. There's different ways that we English words that we translate to mana, but it's also about your connection to the land and your mana over the land as well in this case. Whenua. Now whenua, we spoke about whenua last week. Whenua translates to land. It also means placenta. And so last week when we were looking at Te Ao Māori worldview, we talked about whenua and that idea of whenua either being land or placenta and giving life. Rangatiratanga. Now, rangatiratanga is chiefly authority, self-determination and leadership, and it's one of the key principles in Te Tiriti or Waitangi. And One kupu that I don't have in here is ahi ka. Ahi ka. And ahi ka is about continuous occupation. So we will talk more about that later on in the webinar. Ngā mihi nui. Cool, so let's get into it. So Mana Whenua. So understanding, we're going to get into who Mana Whenua are and understanding each of these aspects and how to begin to engage. Ka pai. So first off, who are Mana Whenua? So Mana Whenua are Māori who have had who have ancestral authority over particular land areas. Their authority in those areas and within that whenua, that land, stems from their whakapapa, so their genealogy, intergenerational connection to the land, the waters, and the taonga, the resources of that place. You'll often engage with Mana Whenua through either iwi tribes or sub-tribes, hapu, and they hold rights and responsibilities over their rohe, their region. In terms of the kupu, the word itself, Mana Whenua, mana, like I explained before, refers to that authority, the prestige, the responsibility, and whenua, meaning land, of that land. So in our belief, Mana Whenua are not just a cultural voice or an advisory group, they're also the right holders of that place, and their status is inherited through whakapapa, not just granted to them. They have deep connection culturally and historically, and spiritual connections to that land which they've resided for very, very long periods of time. I've put this picture here of a fire, and I spoke about ahi ka, continuous occupation and stewardship. Last week when we looked at some kaupapa Māori, we spoke about kaitiakitanga, stewardship, guardianship over the land and resources, and ahi ka connects to this as well in terms of continuous occupation in an area. So my question to you all is, do you know who the Mana Whenua are in your rohe, in your region? And if you do, please put it in the chat now. Ka pai. So rights and responsibilities of Mana Whenua. Mana Whenua hold both rights and responsibilities under tikanga, under protocols and tikanga Māori, and te tiriti o Waitangi. These being kaitiakitanga, as we spoke of, guardianship and protection of natural resources. And an example of this is Ihu Mātau, when we saw the protests happening there. So, and the issue around that piece of whenua, that piece of land, particularly having cultural significance to that iwi. Rangatiratanga, self-determination and authority over their lands and people. And an example of this, we spoke last week around Tūhoi and Te Urewera Forest and Te Urewera Forest Board. And what had happened was, after the settlement, Te Urewera Forest was given back to Tūhoi and no longer sits under the Crown. So it's Tūhoi have rangatiratanga over Te Urewera Forest and care for that park, that piece of whenua. Whakapapa. Whakapapa, our intergenerational connection to the land, history and identity. Last week we spoke around pepeha, and pepeha being a very unique Māori concept where we introduce ourselves via declaration to landmarks passed down through our genealogy, passed down through whakapapa. And so everybody knows when you say ko hekurangi te maunga, waiapu te awa, that mountain and that river is from Ngāti Porou. and therefore Ngāti Porou, as an example, have rights and responsibility, being the mana whenua, to be the kaitiaki and look after those landmarks of importance. And lastly, one of the responsibilities of mana whenua is to uphold tikanga and safeguard cultural integrity. Also remembering that tikanga protocols can change within different rohe, within different regions. And an example of this, I stay here in Te Whanganui-a-Tara in Pōneke, Wellington, and the mana whenua in this region is Te Ātiawa, and they have a relationship with the government in Wellington, especially around upholding tikanga pertaining to Te Ātiawa within this space. So gatherings, pōwhiri, whakatau, and those sorts of protocols that happen here are done so under Te Ātiawa protocol and tikanga. Ka pai. So engaging with mana whenua. First off, the question, why engage? Engaging with mana whenua is essential on several levels. First, legally, it's required and good practice under Te Tiriti o Waitangi and legislation like the Resource Management Act, which we will look into further along in this webinar. Ethically, and just under good principles, it's about honouring Indigenous authority and rights that have often been sidelined. Practically, it leads to better decision making, and also having engagement with mana whenua offers place-based knowledge that's holistic and intergenerational, long-standing knowledge within that region, and it builds better relationships and outcomes for all of the parties involved. And culturally, it's the respectful thing to do. So when we think about engaging and why to engage, we want to think about moving beyond tokenism and how we can have shared outcomes, shared responsibilities, and shared futures together here in Aotearoa. Ka pai. So the Resource Management Act, perhaps in the spaces that you're working in, you would have heard of the Resource Management Act, or RMA for short. And it's one of the most important legislative tools where Te Tiriti o Waitangi principles are applied. Its purpose is to promote the sustainable management of natural and physical resources here in Aotearoa. And there are certain sections within the Resource Management Act pertaining to Māori and Te Tiriti o Waitangi, like Section 6E, recognise and provide for relationships of Māori and their culture and traditions with their ancestral lands, waters, sites, wāhi tapu, or sacred sites, and other taonga. Section 6E requires decision makers to recognise that relationship that Māori have with the land, the water, and taonga, and engage with them. Section 8 says decision makers must take the treaty principles into account. And so in terms of mana whenua, iwi and hapu must be consulted in resource consent processes, planning, and environmental decisions that affect their rohe, their region or area. The RMA is evolving, but the need to engage with mana whenua in a meaningful and mana enhancing way, in my opinion, will always remain. So why does it matter? What does it mean? In terms of why it matters, the legal requirements, as I spoke of, consulting with mana whenua, it upholds cultural and environmental responsibilities, which I think here in Aotearoa is a shared responsibility as well. It supports better, more informed decision making, and it builds enduring relationships that are based on trust and respect amongst stakeholders and mana whenua. So I spoke about the treaty principles. This is also perhaps something that you might have heard in the media lately, because there's submissions in the hikoi that took place at the end of last year. So it is quite a hot topic at the moment. Heoi, to breeze over the treaty principles, and of course don't want to go too in depth in this, but I think it is worth talking about within this webinar, especially in relation to engagement in why it matters. The Treaty Principles Bill came out in 1987, and it requires the Crown to act in a manner that is consistent with the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. In terms of when we look at Te Tiriti signed in 1840, there's been long-standing tensions around the different translations of Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the Treaty of Waitangi. And so in 1987, this Treaty Principles Bill came about to ensure that the intent of Te Tiriti is reflected in Crown and Māori engagement. So the recognised treaty principles is partnership, and this requires Crown to work alongside Māori as equals, building respectful and collaborative relationships. Partnership, include Māori in meaningfully at every stage of processes. Participation, sorry. Yes, that's what we just said. Protection, safeguard Māori taonga. So this includes land, language, culture, and our sacred sites, our wāhi tapu that we spoke about earlier. Rangatiratanga, respect Māori authority and self-determination within their own rohe. So that could look like councils or government working alongside ahika Mana Whenua of that area, and also their interests within that area as well, relating to whenua, resources, and taonga, waterways, as we've spoken about. Equity, addressing barriers to ensure fair outcomes for Māori. So these principles impact us all here living in Aotearoa, and I guess the intent of being able to reflect these principles within our mahi, within our work that we do with engaging with Māori, and especially within, I guess, land surveying sector as well. Ka pai. So I guess what I wanted to do was have a section to talk about what would that look like in action for you in the spaces that you're working in. And so how would we make these treaty principles practical and real? So if we looked at partnership, what that could look like is building trusted working relationships with Mana Whenua in the areas that you survey. Acknowledging their role as kaitiaki, as guardians and decision makers. So building those really strong relationships, and we'll talk about that later on in the webinar around, how to build those strong relationships, what could be common issues that come up, and how to work around that as well. If we look at the principle of participation, what that looks like is involving Mana Whenua early on in projects that affect their whenua, their waterways, their sacred sites, and their cultural sites of significance. This is a really, really important one in terms of maintaining those good relationships with Mana Whenua and their interests, and recognising that interest in those within the land, the water, the sacred sites or sites of significance that you'll be surveying and engaging with. Protection, identifying, protecting, and reporting any taonga any wāhi tapu or sensitive environmental features during your planning and field work. Like I said, I think if we go back to building relationships and building the strong relationships, and how we can do that when we, say, come across anything that is sensitive when we are doing work in the field. How can we involve them in that if any taonga are found, and how we can bring them to be a part of that, the full journey, not just bringing them in here and there. Ka pai, rangatiratanga. Respecting iwi and hapu authority over their rohe, and ensuring that boundaries, land design and development uphold their aspirations when working within their rohe as well. So, as has been mentioned previously in this webinar, it's around recognising and respecting the role that Mana Whenua have had, not just today, but long-standing within their region, and ensuring that that development uphold their aspirations as well. And active protection. Proactively share information and advocate for Māori perspectives within project teams. So I know that everybody, I'm sure, when it comes to a project, has their different roles that they need to play, but ensuring that advocating for Māori perspectives are forefront and not an afterthought, and actively protecting that as well. Ka pai. So if we look at an engagement process, understanding, this next part is about understanding how the structures of iwi and hapu, what those can look like, and recognizing that each iwi and hapu have their unique identity, their unique leadership and protocols, and recognizing this diversity is probably one of the first steps in terms of building those relationships with Mana Whenua and engaging with them. Ka pai. So understanding the engagement process. Engagement with Mana Whenua is not a one-off exercise. It is a process, and I believe that preparation is critical. Before you engage, ensure that you've done your research, you understand the historical and cultural context as well, out of respect for the Mana Whenua. And when making contact, take that time to build the relationship rather than rushing to obtain any outcome. So researching, like I said, the iwi hapu, their history, what's their connection to the land. When you do make initial contact, approaching Mana Whenua with respect and acknowledging tikanga Māori, and we'll dive into that a little bit more shortly. Consultation. When you are engaging with Māori and consulting with them, listen actively, be transparent as well, and share decision-making power. This one is especially important around, I guess, that engagement process, having them at the forefront, having them along from the beginning rather than an afterthought of, oh, have we engaged with Mana Whenua? Do we need to engage? Having that as a forefront, at the forefront, before any project takes off. Collaboration. This is around developing long-term relationships with ongoing dialogue. Ensure that the kōrero, the dialogue, is both ways, and that, like we said in the consultation piece, that you're being transparent and sharing that decision-making power. So that's an ongoing dialogue between the two parties. And finally, implementing and reviewing. So ensuring that the commitments made during this process is honoured and that the outcomes are monitored for each party. Ka pai, culturally and appropriate engagement. There could be times when people say, well, we want to engage with Mana Whenua, but how do we do that? And there can be a lack of knowledge of how to do that correctly. As I mentioned earlier on in the webinar, each iwi, tribe, even sub-tribes, hapu and whānau, can have their own tikanga, protocols, and ways in which they do things within their regions. So in light of that, making meaningful relationships with Mana Whenua and asking those questions before engaging or at the initial engagement is really important in terms of how we engage in a culturally appropriate way. I guess, when we think about engaging with Mana Whenua, we want to think that they're not just another voice around the table, they are the voice of the whenua, of the area that you're working in. And so what that means is respecting tikanga, so respecting their individual tikanga, their protocols, the values unique to their iwi and hapu. Understanding, like I said before, that relationships can take time, and rushing that process is not necessarily respectful or effective, and sometimes can do worse to the relationship that you're trying to build with the Mana Whenua. So taking that time to build a really strong relationship. Knowing the history, as mentioned before, many iwi tribes and hapu sub-tribes carry their own, they have their own history, they have their own whakapapa, genealogy and connection to the land, and along with that also can come maybe historical trauma from land loss. And so we want to be aware of those things, especially when we're engaging with Mana Whenua around projects involving areas that are connected to them. So a good question to ask yourself, instead of thinking, how do I consult or engage with them, asking yourself, who are the Mana Whenua of this region that I'm doing this project in? And how can I engage with them with openness? And am I approaching this as a partnership or a transaction? Sometimes these can be confronting questions, but when we think about building those long-standing relationships that will stand into the future, these are the questions that we need to be asking ourselves. Ka pai. So a few tikanga and protocols that I wanted to go over. I know that this is particularly about engaging with Mana Whenua. We spoke more about tikanga or Māori protocols last week in the Te Ao Māori webinar, but I felt that these were particularly important in regards to engaging with Mana Whenua and how we go about things the right way according to Māori custom. So tikanga means protocols, and the word tika in Te Reo Māori means right or correct. Ka pai. So some key tikanga that we want to be aware of is, first off, whakawhanaungatanga. And so whakawhanaungatanga is about building relationships with each other. We did a form of whakawhanaungatanga at the start of this webinar when I introduced myself. I was able to introduce myself, make you more familiar with who I am, and place me here. So whakawhanaungatanga, starting with whakawhanaungatanga, when engaging, if you know about your family's whakapapa or history, genealogy, sharing that. To Māori, these things are really important. It's a value a very strong value around your place in this world and finding your place in this world. So this is how we make connections with one another, and this is how we build trust with each other. Secondly, kanohi ki te kanohi. So kanohi ki te kanohi is face-to-face. Face-to-face engagement. It builds trust and respect among, I guess, the stakeholders of the projects. And so if you're engaging, practically you could ask yourself, does that look like me meeting with, what's the difference in terms of building a strong relationship between meeting online or actually going into meet these people, kanohi ki te kanohi, face to face. I guarantee you'll have a better outcome if you go and engage with Mana Whenua face to face. Karanga and mihi. So upon that thought of kanohi ki te kanohi, engaging with Mana Whenua could perhaps mean partaking in a pōwhiri. And so what you might see during a process, either a pōwhiri, a welcome, or a whakatau, which is another form of welcome, are karanga, a ceremonial call done by a woman, wahine, and mihi, which are greetings, whai kōrero speeches that open a formal engagement. So things you might want to think about upon going in to engage with Māori is around, getting some support to craft a mihi, a greeting to these people, so that when the time is right during that process, you're able to greet the Mana Whenua in a culturally appropriate way. Another thing to think about in terms of engaging with Mana Whenua is koha. So koha is known as a gesture of respect, it's contribution. So when you're going to visit, especially on a marae, you want to think about, the hospitality that is shown to you and how you can contribute towards that. Quite often now, this is done in the form of money. However, back in the days, this was also contribution through, say, kumara or different kai that could be shared. So thinking about that beforehand and being aware of that if you are going into a formal engagement with Mana Whenua, such as a pōwhiri or whakatau. Ka pai. And lastly, manaakitanga. We spoke about manaakitanga last week. Manaakitanga quite often is translated to hospitality, but I like to translate it to mutual hospitality. So it's about showing care, generosity, and caring for and respecting others, but this is done in a mutual way as well. So while there are expectations on the host to manaaki, to be hospitable, generous, and caring, there are also expectations on the guest to do the same. Ka pai. And so the last point in regards to tikanga and protocols is to remember that each iwi have their own tikanga, and be sure to ask and follow their lead. It's my belief that there isn't anything wrong with asking, say, if you are engaging with Mana Whenua and you have been invited to go and partake in a pōwhiri process as part of that engagement and the beginning of building that relationship. I believe that it's the right thing to do to ask during that time before the engagement, before the pōwhiri, are there any tikanga that I need to be aware of before attending the pōwhiri? And that way they can guide you around how they do things within that rohe. Ka pai. So best practices for engagement with Mana Whenua. Get an understanding of the local iwi and hapu governance structures. So this can change, depending on that iwi tribe or hapu sub-tribe. So you want to get an understanding of that, and that way you're going to engage with them in a way that's meaningful to them and works along with their governance structure as well. Engage early and consistently. So we have spoken about this around engaging at the beginning of a project, not in the final stages of a project. In terms of relationship building, this isn't going to go down very well. So ensure that you're engaging early, you're engaging consistently, that open, transparent communication that we spoke about previously. Build genuine relationships based on trust and reciprocity. Ensuring that proper representation from iwi hapu leaders while you're engaging with Māori. You want to ensure that you're engaging with those who are representatives of the iwi, the tribe, and the hapu, the sub-tribe. And lastly, be open to mātauranga Māori. So mātauranga Māori is our Māori knowledge systems. Be open to it and open-minded to receiving this mātauranga. Our iwi, our tribes, and hapu sub-tribes have extensive knowledge and mātauranga around their whenua, their lands and their waterways and their resources. So be open to that when you're engaging with Māori. Ka pai. So challenges. I guess it's like any sort of relationship, challenges can arise, but I don't think that this is anything that can't be worked through. Being proactive, patient, and willing to work through challenges is key to successful engagement with Mana Whenua. So a few of these challenges, first off, uncertainty about who to contact. That could be in terms of, if you have a project, well, who do I contact about this and how do I get in contact with them? So a solution to that is to use iwi registers or contact your council. All councils around Aotearoa should have a relationship with the Mana Whenua of that region. So contacting the council and asking the question around, who is the Mana Whenua of this area and how do I get in contact with them to ensure that you get in contact with the right person. Perhaps differing expectations around engagement. Develop clear engagement plans with the Mana Whenua that you're engaging with agreed outcomes. Having that conversation at the beginning of the engagement around what can be expected from both parties. Lastly, capacity constraints within iwi and hapu. This can be an issue, especially if iwi and hapu engaged in a project perhaps don't have resources. So this is where you can discuss around providing resources where appropriate to support the iwi and hapu participation. Ka pai. So some common mistakes to avoid. In terms, here's just a list of a few, but treating all iwi and hapu the same. As spoken about before, you want to learn about who the Mana Whenua are in the region that you are dealing with, and you want to approach with curiosity and an open mind to learn more about that iwi, that tribe, or that hapu, that sub-tribe. Each iwi and hapu can differ, and they're unique in their ways, and so you want to ask those questions and approach with an open mind rather than treating everyone the same. Secondly, don't consult as a formality or after decisions are made. This, in my space working in education, is something that I see quite often in regards to consultation happening after the decisions have been made around a project. And like I've stressed throughout this webinar, we want to ensure that we're engaging with Mana Whenua from the outset of a project, rather than bringing them in at the end and not having them as a part of that decision-making process. Thirdly, overlooking tikanga or trying to rush protocols. As I mentioned, around having an open mind when it comes to engaging with Māori, going through a tikanga Māori process, a Māori protocol process, and being open to that and not rushing that. There are processes and protocols, and that's all part of this journey on engaging with Mana Whenua. Don't rely on one person to speak for all Māori. So Māori are a very diverse group. We have our iwi, our tribes, and our hapu, our sub-tribes. And so ensuring that one Māori from, say, another iwi doesn't speak for all Māori across Aotearoa. So understanding that, and that comes down to ensuring that you're connecting with the right people, that you're making relationships with the right people and engaging with the mana whenua of that area. And lastly, don't assume that silence is agreement. Relationships take time, and silence can often mean reflection or caution, especially when it comes to land matters regarding our whenua, our waterways, our resources. There can be some mistrust there. So there are a lot of moving parts when dealing with mana whenua and things that we need to be aware of when we're engaging with them. But if we can approach this with humility and openness, I feel that these are things that we can work through as well when engaging with mana whenua. Ka pai. So our next steps, based on the kōrero that I've shared here today, what I'd love to encourage you all to do is to do some self-reflection and ask yourself what your organisation could do to improve engagement with mana whenua. Where are the gaps in your understanding when engaging with mana whenua? Are there skill gaps? Are there knowledge gaps? And what can you do about filling those gaps to get better engagement? And reflect on what will you do better after today's session. There are many resources online, and in terms of further learning, I would recommend reading resources on Te Tiriti o Waitangi, tikanga, Māori governments. Perhaps you could partake in a more in-depth workshop about these topics if that's one of your skill gaps or knowledge gaps. Ka pai. So what I'd love to do now is open the chat. If there are any questions, please feel free to send them through and I can answer them.
Thank you, Nathalia. If any of our listeners online do have any questions, can you please pop those into the Q&A box now, and Nathalia will answer those for you. Nathalia, it doesn't look like we have any questions coming through today. So thank you once again for presenting to our members and to our people listening online. If you do have any questions once we end this live stream, please email them to us here at National Office at Survey Spatial New Zealand, and we will pass them on to Nathalia for answering for you. Once again, thank you, Nathalia, and thank you everybody for joining us today.
Ngā mihi koutou. Thank you for coming along to this webinar.